tree a little bit more. We talked about infrastructure last time. There's one more thing I need to clear with you guys, and that's addresses. And what I mean by addresses is how does a signal that you send over the internet know where you want it to go? So I'm sure you've heard the term IP address before. I mean, most people have. And an IP address looks something like this. You've probably seen a number that looks like this somewhere. These numbers do have a little bit of significance. I'm not going to break it down for you right now, though, because it's not that important. But at the end of the day, an IP address... Oops. At the end of the day, an IP address is a phone number. But it's a phone number for computers. So what I mean by this is that you know that if you take your phone, you type in a number, you're going to connect to the person you want to connect to, right? If you know your friend's phone number and you type it in your phone, you know that their phone's going to ring. An IP address is pretty much the same thing, but for a computer. The thing is, right, that humans are very bad at working with numbers in general. Like, we're not very good at remembering them, and they don't connect to us. So if every time you wanted to connect to Google, for example, you had to remember some random large digit number like this, you'd probably find it very difficult, because like it's possible that you would remember this number after a while of having to type it in, for sure. But if you had to do that for every single website that you go to, and every new website that came out, you had to memorize new numbers, it would just get very hard. And humans, we're just not good at this. So instead, what we need to do is we need to take the websites that you see, like google.com, for example, and we need to map it to its IP address in a way that people don't see. And this is exactly what happens, right? You don't realize it, but every single time that you go connect to a website on the internet, you're actually using an IP address to do that. It's just invisibly behind the scenes. There's a process that's happening that you're not told about. It doesn't tell you it's happening, as it does. That resolves the IP address for you based on the name, right? So the name at the end of the day is really just a tool for human beings. Google.com, for example, literally just a tool for human beings. Once the messages actually get sent, they're going to be using IP addresses to get where they need to go. So whenever you use your computer, so here you are, you're on a web browser, for example, and you want to send, you go to your web browser and you type in google.com. Behind the scenes, what's going to happen is your computer is going to look in its own storage. The storage as in what I was talking about in previous videos, right? Like there's information stored in your computer. It's going to look inside its own storage first. And it's going to say, do I already know the IP address? Have I already been to this place before? And did I save the IP address for later? Which is what the computer does automatically. If it can't find it, what's going to happen is it's then going to send another message to your router, which sends a message to something called a resolver. The resolver is another computer. It's a computer that has its own storage. And the resolver, importantly, is owned by your ISP, which is your internet service provider. So one of the things that internet service providers are doing for you is they're allowing this website names to work. So this message gets sent to your ISP. It knows that you're trying to get to google.com. It's going to check its own storage and say, have I seen this website before? Did I save the IP address? If it didn't, it's going to go through another process. And I'm going to run through this kind of quickly because it's not that important, but I think it's still interesting. So the ISP, the resolver, says, I don't know where this IP address is, so now I've got to go figure that out. It goes first of all to something called a root server, which is just another computer. And the root server is able to understand the end of a website. So it's able to look at the .com piece, and it's able to tell what class of website that is. And when I say class of website, what I mean is there are certain ends of websites like .com, for example, .ca, .co.uk, etc., etc. And these website names are trusted. They've gone through a committee and they've been decided as, I think they're called top tier, like A class websites or something like that. I can't remember. But basically, they're kind of like the top tier domain name you can have. They're trusted by people. They don't look sketchy. Lots of legit websites have that as the end of them. And so they're called, they have a special place. There are other kinds of websites too, and I'm not sure like how they're categorized. I haven't really looked into this very much, but I'm sure you could have like .ants and .I am great. There's no reason that you couldn't have this be the end of your domain name. The only thing is these kinds of websites don't necessarily have a category, and so they haven't been mapped inside the root servers to be able to be resolved into IP addresses, right? So the only real difference between like a website with this name and the website with this name is that there is a system in place that deals with websites that have this name already. And the other names that I'm talking about, they're just not registered to this server. Anyway, so a message goes to the root server. It finds out that you have a class A website. So then it sends it off to another computer called I don't know, it's probably a class A server or TDS server, I think it was called. I can't completely remember why. Top domain server, maybe something like that. Anyway, and that top domain server knows how to deal with .coms, it knows how to deal with .co.uk's, and it actually knows how to find the IP address related to these websites, right? Then the TDS server sends a message back and says, okay, you need to go to the authoritative server, which is just another computer, a big computer, but another computer. And this computer is going to be the authoritative computer for .com websites, and it's going to be able to tell you the IP address of the website. So it takes the .com website and turns it into an actual IP address that points to a computer somewhere on the internet. So once that's done, it sends the IP address back to the resolver. The resolver is going to say, okay, great, this is new. I now know what google.com's IP address is. I'm going to save that in my storage. It saves it in the storage, and then it sends it back to you. And then your computer is going to automatically say, okay, great, like I've seen Google now. I know what its IP address is. It's going to save it in its own storage. And then it's going to cross out google.com, change it to whatever IP address you got, and use that to send a message to that computer over the internet. And that's kind of it. That's how addressing works. That's what an IP address does. It just maps to some other computer on the internet and goes through this system of changing like the domain names into IP addresses so that we can use names as humans. Now you're probably wondering, well, how does this server even know? How does that server even know what the IP address of Google is, right? And that's literally at the end of the day because someone told it. So I don't know if you've ever gone on google.com, like domains.com or something like that, but you can buy a domain name. So if you go on the internet, you can go to a website and you can buy a domain. And when you buy a domain name on a website, so let's say you buy a domain like, I have a domain, it's hexthedev.com. There's nothing there right now, but I do have this domain name. So I own the domain name hexthedev.com. So what's going to happen is once I've bought that domain name, I'm going to be able to sign into a website where I tell that domain what computer to point to, right? So the authoritative server is going to get updated automatically by the website that I bought it from. So if I buy hexthedev.com from domains.com, domains.com is then going to communicate with the authoritative servers and tell them that this is a website that exists, and it's going to tell them the IP address. Now, how do you know what the IP address is? Well, I am going to put that in. So if I know that I have a computer somewhere that I've set up, you got to do some special setup stuff to make it so that it has a public facing IP address. But let's say I set up a computer and I set it up properly so that that computer has an IP address. What I can do is I can tell domains.com that I want hexthedev.com to point to some random address, right? And if I do that, it will allow the authoritative servers, domains.com will then tell the authoritative servers what IP address my domain points to. So that was kind of a lot. I know there was a lot of words there, but this is very simple at the end of the day. Like, there's a lot of complicated stuff going on in the sense that, like, we have to figure out where to find the IP addresses for things. But if you break it down to its core concepts, it's very, very simple. The IP address is a phone number. The google.com is a alias for that phone number. It's just a label that I'm giving to a phone number. So like when you add a contact in your phone, you're just giving a name to a number, right? And then your computer automatically, without you knowing it, does the resolution of that name to the IP address invisibly behind the scenes every single time you try and send a web message. And that's it. I don't think we need to go beyond that. Next time I'm gonna start talking about, okay, now you know that there is an address to get to a computer. Next time I'm going to talk about what the computers are actually doing at those addresses when you go and log into when you go to a website. And that's it.